At the time of the creation of the Bill of Rights, it was a common belief that governments often used their military power to oppress their citizens. The solution, then, was to allow citizens to arm themselves. Now, during the drafting of the Constitution, the Constitutional Convention decided that the federal government should have the ability to create peacetime standing armies and to regulate the militia. This sparked outcry from anti-federalists, who argued that this would take away their defense against a federal takeover. Federalists, on the other hand, thought their fears were overblown, because the population was armed and would be nearly impossible to subdue. The one thing that both parties agreed on, then, was that the government should not infringe on the right of the people to keep and bear arms, thus the creation of the Second Amendment. Since that time, much has changed. The traditional militia was replaced by a state militia, which then joined the federal military. Also, America's military now is extremely powerful, so it would be nearly impossible for armed citizens alone to defeat it. In the 18th century, civilians kept their weapons for the militia at home. Nowadays, civilian weapons and military weapons are significantly different. All this change begs the question, is the Second Amendment still effective in its current form, or does it need to be modified? To find out, I interviewed two CA students.
First thing with the Second Amendment and firearm rights in general is, first off, the Second Amendment was written at a time when firearms were a lot different. Firearms were not automatic assault weapons that they are today. They were black powder weapons, single-action weapons that were a lot easier to control and were a lot less powerful. And especially at that point, it was more necessary to have them to live for things like hunting. Nowadays, I still think, yes, people should have the right to have weapons, to have firearms. However, I think the big thing is restrictions. And I don't think anyone in this country can deny that there is a problem with restrictions.
I would say that the Second Amendment definitely means a lot to me. I actually don't personally own a gun, but I think that the founders put it in there because they want to make sure that, a tyrannical government can never take over the people, because the people will have arms to defend themselves. And I think that we forget about that today when, our government is so big now, but we never ever think about, the drawbacks of that. We never really think about, the implications of a tyrannical government. So yeah, I think the Second Amendment doesn't just protect your right to own a gun, it protects your right to protect yourself from the government. It's definitely completely necessary to protect the right. I think that even pro-gun people today might take the wrong approach. Like they always talk about, these guns are part of our livelihood, but I think they should point out the true reasoning for owning this gun and sort of go back to what the founders were saying.
So people should be able to own rifles for the purpose of hunting and whatnot. There definitely needs to be restrictions on things like times when you can purchase them. There's some loopholes as far as gun shows and gun dealers that make it a lot easier for people to get them without having to have a waiting period. I think in addition to that, you have to take into account things like criminal background checks need to be a lot more thorough.
I think that it would be in the best interests of people selling guns to go through the background checks. So I do think that you should have some form of, background checks. But I think that once again, you have to look at the restrictions on what a background check, like what it entails and what it does. Because you don't want to overreach, like some criteria for owning a gun, it can be ambiguous.
So I do think at the same time that people in this country should have a right to firearms. But once again, I think you need to draw into question certain restrictions. Things like, should people be allowed to own high-capacity automatic firearms? Is there really a necessity for that in our society? Obviously there's the argument for concealed carry. I think that's something you can discuss. As far as personal protection, I think there's the argument for shotguns or long rifles. However, if you're talking about somebody owning a high-capacity automatic weapon, what's really the point of that in this country? And is that a safe thing to allow?
I think that it's really controversial because people think that, like when you see shootings on the street or like in public places, it really puts a sense of fear in people. And I think that that's dangerous. I think it's even more dangerous in the shootings themselves when, you have people fearing all of these things that are happening. And I think that it creates an environment where you don't see the other side of things, because I think that in the end, people owning guns legally is far more safer in every way than because like the bad guys will always be able to own guns. They'll always be able to find their way to get these weapons, but you can't take the guns away from, or you can't try to restrict the people who lawfully own guns. So I really don't think there should be any restrictions on gun rights. I think that they should all be carefully reviewed because we have to always look at the constitutional principle behind them.